Welcome. My name is Mary Ann, and I'm going to tell you a bedtime story. So get comfortable, lay back, and relax so you can listen to the story of the Scarlett Cardinal. The first time Joan spotted a cardinal on the railing of her back deck, it was Friday afternoon, and she had just finished cleaning up after lunch. She ate a little later today, which was highly unusual, as she was very regimented and barely strayed from her regular routine. It was almost 1:30 when her friend Sue arrived. Sue had just returned from a trip out to the West Coast, and Joan was eager to see her again. Joan prepared an assortment of tea sandwiches for lunch, the triangular kind often served at showers and high tea, and she arranged them on a tiered platter. There was tuna salad, egg salad, cream cheese and cucumber, and smoked salmon and cream cheese. The tiered platter had belonged to her grandmother, Mamie. It was embellished with intricate gold and pink roses. Mamie grew up in England and emigrated as a young child. This was the only heirloom that Joan had, so she used it whenever she could. Joan wasn't one of those people that kept fancy dishes, linens, or even silverware for special occasions. She believed that every day was special and a reason to celebrate. She laid out her favorite French linen tablecloth. She had picked it up at a market in Paris many years ago. It was covered in beautiful peach-colored roses. She set the table with the china and proper teacups left to her by her mother. Her mother had so many cups that before she passed, she had affixed a piece of masking tape to the bottoms with initials on them, delineating which ones would go to each of her children. When Sue arrived, the two women embraced before sitting down to enjoy the meal Joan had so lovingly prepared. "The house smells wonderful. What did you bake?" "You'll see soon enough. Are you hungry?" "I'm famished." "All right then, let's eat." The two friends sat down at the glass table as the afternoon sun streamed into the brightly lit sun kitchen. "The table looks so nice, Joan. This must have been so much work." "Not at all," Joan replied. "It's a labor of love. Besides, it's been a while since I've had anyone over, and I love entertaining." The two women spent 3 hours chatting and nibbling. Sue commented on how deliciously satisfying the tea sandwiches were. "You know, I find whenever I eat tea sandwiches, I swear I eat more because they're so small, and in my mind, I'm not overeating." The two women laughed, and shortly thereafter, Joan brought out the delicious baking that Sue had commented on when she entered. Joan loved baking, as she found that it always seemed to fill a house with warmth. Sue's eyes widened to see Joan carrying in a tray of cranberry and lemon scones she had made earlier that day. Joan even went so far as to prepare clotted cream, and had some fresh strawberry preserves she had made last summer, which she served alongside them. The two women happily enjoyed several cups of Earl Grey tea with their dessert. Sue then retrieved her camera from her purse and proceeded to show Joan the photographs she had taken from her trip out west. Joan couldn't believe her eyes. The mountains were absolutely astounding. They seemed to stretch across the entire expanse of a cloudless blue sky. The ocean beneath looked navy, and from the photograph she could see that it had been a windy day, as there were white caps visible on the waves. There were photos of beautiful, dense forests. The grounds were covered in ferns, wild mushrooms, and lush emerald moss. Sue pointed out the various trees, which included spruce, pine, maple, and birch. Sue also had photographs of orchards. There were gorgeous photos of plump green and red grapes in rows. Looking at these photographs planted a seed in Joan's mind. She decided that she too would visit the West Coast one day and began to take note of the places she saw in Sue's photographs, imagining herself there in the not so distant future. The conversation flowed easily. The two women had been friends since they worked together years ago in an office downtown. They often talked about the day they first met. Joan was in the lunchroom and had just turned the coffee machine on when Sue walked in and sat down. They struck up a casual conversation when out of the corner of Joan's eye she saw water, brown water, overflowing and dripping all over the counter. Both women jumped up and scrambled to stop the overpour, working together quickly, laughing nervously. Joan had forgot to put the filter in. The two women laughed and became fast friends. Joan's desk was situated right next to Sue's. They shared their troubles, their laughter, and their triumphs over countless lunches. They always celebrated each other's birthdays, and every year they exchanged Christmas gifts. Now that both women were retired, they didn't see each other as often, so they had a lot of catching up to do. Joan told Sue about the birth of her grandchild, Sammy. This was her first grandchild, and she was ecstatic. Sammy was a chubby baby with blue eyes and a hearty laugh. He was 12 pounds when he was born, and when the doctor saw him, he exclaimed, "This one's overcooked." Joan told Sue that every time she was with Sammy, she thought her heart might burst with joy. Joan shared several pictures of Sammy with Sue. The two women were giddy. Joan knew that she had a good friend in Sue, and though they didn't see each other quite as much anymore, they were always there for one another. The afternoon was perfect, and when Sue mentioned that she had to leave so she could get dinner ready in time, Joan was surprised. Funny, she thought to herself, how quickly time passes some days and how slow it moves on others. Before Sue departed, the two women made plans to see one another again. Joan watched Susan drive off in her old blue Volkswagen and waved to her from her doorstep. Joan lived in the suburbs in a bungalow with a large birch tree in the center of her front yard. The sight of this tree made her happy, as it reminded her of when her children were young. They had planted the tree 27 years ago, and she remembered how, when it was just a sapling, her children and their friends would jump over it. This was long before her divorce. Sometimes she thought of her life then and how different it was now. She smiled to herself as she closed the door and headed back inside to the living room. Since Joan lived alone, she didn't have to worry about preparing dinner. As a matter of fact, she was still quite full from their long, languid lunch. If she got hungry later, she could make herself some toast with sourdough bread. Toast with butter and blueberry jam was her favorite snack. Now she would rest. This was one of the things she liked most about being retired. You could nap whenever you pleased. She rearranged the pillows on the couch, removed her slippers, and then pulled the knitted brown and orange afghan she had for years over her to keep warm. She then laid back on the soft velvet couch. This was the most comfortable couch she had ever owned, and she loved to spend lazy afternoons reading a book or just lying there looking outside at her backyard. From where she lay, she could see the Scarlett Cardinal perched upon the rail of her back deck. It sang its song, and she closed her eyes and listened. She felt very relaxed. Her head began to nod, and soon she gave in to sleep. Her sleep came quickly, as did her dreams. In her dream, she saw herself walking on a gravel path. It was approaching dusk. The sun was slowly dipping in the west, and in about an hour it would be dark. Looking behind her, she saw the lights of the busy city. If she listened intently enough, she could hear the hum of distant cars. As she continued to walk, the sounds of the city faded, and she listened to the sound of her footsteps as they met the pebbled path she walked on. The crunching sound satisfied her. At that moment, a blue jay flew by. She remembered that someone had told her that blue jays weren't actually blue. Their feathers are in fact brown and contain air pockets that act as a prism, refracting light, making their feathers appear blue. Nature was so interesting to her. Looking ahead, she noticed that the gravel path came to an end, and she soon would be standing on the edge of a forest. She noticed a worn pathway and felt an urge to follow it. Stepping into the forest, a sense of peace overcame her. The scent of pine and cedar permeated the air with freshness. Her whole being was calm. Wildflowers appeared here and there in spots among lush grasses and hardy ferns. She spotted echinacea, black-eyed Susans, lavender, and a host of plants she couldn't name. Mushrooms of various shapes and sizes sprouted up here and there. The whole forest was completely alive. She felt at home here. She decided to rest and sat back against a tall maple, closing her eyes. She sensed the whole forest breathing. She attuned her breath to the breath of the forest. Shortly thereafter, she decided to lay down and stared up, marveling at all of the tall trees around her. She could see bits of blue sky in between branches. It amazed her how the branches of trees almost touched each other. It was as though they knew to give each other just the right amount of space needed to grow. She remembered reading about how trees actually communicated and cared for each other. They formed symbiotic relationships with fungal networks, sharing resources like water and nutrients. In fact, larger, older trees used the network to support smaller, younger seedlings. Nature always fascinated her, and now she felt as though she was supported by it. She was nourished by it. Her whole body was completely at ease. She had not a single worry in her head. She wished she could stay here forever. She could hear various birds singing high in the trees. When she was a young girl, her father would take her on forest walks. He was an avid bird watcher. They would drive out about once a month when the weather was good to see the birds. Her father would always remind her that once they got to the place they were going, she had to be absolutely quiet. He bought her a pair of binoculars for her 8th birthday, and she felt so grown up looking in them. Her father seemed to have the ability to spot a bird miles away. He knew their names, their habitats, and their song. This ability to know a bird by its song amazed Joan. She thought her father must be one of the smartest people alive. Now there was a breeze, and she could discern the faint sound of water lapping up against the shoreline in the distance. Joan decided to get up and go have a look. She walked past branches, and the sun cast shadows all around her. Yet she was still able to see the water up ahead through the worn path. It was a beautiful day. Hundreds of trees crowned the lake in a sea of green. There were several cottages, but they all seemed to be empty. The sun sparkled, creating shining diamonds on the water's surface. There was not a cloud in the sky. Wild daisies, young maples, and milkweed grew by the shoreline. An orange monarch fluttered around a milkweed before making a landing. Joan removed her shoes, folded the bottoms of her pants up, and walked barefoot, stepping into the shallows at the shoreline. The water was unexpectedly warm, and she could see right through to the sandy bottom. The waves formed repeating patterns of rings on the water's bottom, and she was almost hypnotized watching them. A school of minnows whizzed by her feet, darting here and there, all around her. Bright blue and green dragonflies hovered above the water's surface before landing on a nearby rock. Dragonflies were such interesting creatures, though admittedly she found it a little alarming when they seemed to fly directly at you at top speed. Joan listened as the waves kissed the shoreline. The melodic rhythm of the waves began to make her sleepy. She decided to exit the water, lay back on the grassy mound, and close her eyes. The sun warmed her from above. She thought of days spent by the public watering hole as a teen. Her and her friends would ride their bikes in the heat of summer and would often bring snacks to share. There was a rock that they jumped from. Sometimes her childhood friend Helen would bring her transistor radio, and they would sing along to the top 40 songs of the day. It was a time of freedom in her life, and sitting here now, she felt completely content and knew this was exactly where she wanted to be. She heard the sound of footsteps around her. Someone tapped her on the shoulder. Opening her eyes, she was surprised to see it was her late mother. Her mother was wearing the green cardigan she had gifted her many Christmases ago. She looked up and thought to herself, "Mom, it can't be you. You died." Her mother didn't speak but smiled and began to walk back toward the forest. Joan quickly got up, put her shoes back on, and followed. Every so often, her mother would look back and smile to make sure Joan was following along. The whole time, Joan was confused, but knew she must continue on. Joan's mother led her to a spot beneath a giant tree and pointed. Joan had no idea what she was pointing at or looking for, and so she asked her mum, but again her mum didn't speak. Just then, a scarlet cardinal landed on her shoulder. Joan looked up, expecting to see her mum a little ways before her, but she was gone. The cardinal remained on her shoulder, and Joan knew she had to keep walking along this path, which would eventually lead her back to the gravel. The bird sang and accompanied her on the way out. As she met the gravel pathway, the bird took off and flew east. Joan called out to it, but it kept going. She could hear the bird singing, but could no longer see it. She stretched her arms and legs, looked up at the sky, and found herself again on the couch. She looked out into the backyard, and there was the cardinal singing its song, as happy as could be. Joan slowly got up, but felt cool from her nap, so she wrapped the afghan tightly around her and walked toward the window. She remembered dreaming of her mother. The dream was so vivid, it felt real. She was just about to open the sliding door to the back deck when the cardinal looked back at her and flew away. Something felt so familiar about that cardinal, but she knew it was a wild bird. She walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle. She set it on the stove and reached into the cupboard to procure a mug. She couldn't believe her eyes. Before her was her childhood mug with the picture of Alice in Wonderland embossed on it. How could this be? She thought. I haven't seen this in years. She smiled to herself. She sat down and looked out the window, pondered, and then said, "Thank you, Mum," aloud.